I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar. We are focusing on new research around increasing capital investments in ports, a practical toolkit. And I will be your moderator for today. My name is Megan Matheson. I'm the Director of Strategy and Engagement with Clear Seas. And I'd like to start by acknowledging with respect and gratitude that I live and work on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have stewarded these lands and waters since time immemorial. Recognizing and seeking out Indigenous leadership and knowledge for a more inclusive and sustainable maritime sector is an important part of our work at Clear Seas. I will now introduce our speakers and the organizations that will be participating in today's webinar. So first off, we have Clara Kaufman from Clear Seas. Clara is a multidisciplinary researcher with a background in geography, public health, and psychology, and she contributes to our research program in many ways at Clear Seas, scoping and leading research projects, managing multi-year projects with academic, industry, and government partners, and mentoring student researchers in our Indigenous internship program. Clara is based out of Montreal and holds a BA from Bryn Mawr College and an MA in Geography from McGill University. We have also, and then just a little bit about Clear Seas. We are an independent, not-for-profit organization that provides fact-based information to enable governments, industry, and the public to make informed decisions on marine shipping issues. We work to build awareness and trust so that all people can feel a part of the marine sector. Our vision is a sustainable marine shipping sector that is safe, vibrant, and inclusive, both now and for future generations. Next, we have Thomas Bejo Vanderbuy as the technical lead, ports and shipping finance for C40 Cities. He specializes in infrastructure and project financing with experience at the European Investment Bank, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and Infrastructure Ontario. Based in Toronto, Thomas supports C40's mission in the maritime sector globally with a focus on energy and finance. Thomas holds master's degrees in public affairs and business law and a Master of Science in infrastructure and port finance. Thomas is part of C40 Cities, which is a network of nearly 100 mayors of the world's leading cities working to deliver the urgent action needed to confront the climate crisis and create a future where everyone, everywhere, can thrive. Mayors of C40 Cities are committed to using a science-based and people-focused approach to limit global heating in line with the Paris Agreement and build healthy, equitable, and resilient communities. And finally, we have Debbie Murray from the Association of Canadian Port Authorities. Debbie is the Vice President of Government and Industry Affairs with more than 25 years of international policy, regulatory research, and public affairs experience in areas of sustainability, supply chains, innovation, and governance. Debbie's been with ACPA since 2017 and has galvanized the policy and regulatory presence of Canadian port authorities with government and stakeholders alike. Debbie has a range of experience, including working with the National Seafarers Welfare Board, the Natural Resources Canada Hydrogen Strategy, and represents ACPA, the Association of Canadian Port Authorities, on the National Adaptation Strategy Economic Advisory Table, and a broad range of other government forums. The Association of Canadian Port Authorities is a leading voice for Canada's ports, representing the interests of 17 port authorities that make up Canada's national port system. ACPA is the champion and advocate for Canadian ports in matters related to government policy, trade, competitiveness, and public awareness in order to contribute to a sustainable, clean, efficient, and reliable intermodal supply chain and transportation system. Welcome to all our speakers, and welcome to all of those who've joined us since I first started talking. We're really looking forward to today's conversation, and we're going to start off with a little bit of discussion on the role of ports in Canada's supply chain and why you've been hearing so much about trade diversification in the news recently. So I'm going to give a small bit of background, and then we'll have some questions for our panelists to share their thoughts on some of the recent events and the import of this research that they'll be sharing with you today. So we've been on a bit of a roller coaster ride of tariff threats that Canada and the world has been experiencing since January of this year. And this has inspired an unprecedented level of interest in Canada's economy, trade partners, and supply chains across all sectors across the country. And these tariffs are just the latest in a line of shocks to the supply system, ranging from atmospheric rivers to pandemics and labor strikes. One aspect of Canada's supply system that's been exposed is the extent of our reliance on the United States as a primary trading partner. The majority of trade that does not go to the US is carried by ship, which in 2023 represented 42% of Canada's total trade, 24% imports, and 18% exports. Ports, as the interface between land and sea and the nexus of ship, rail, and road transport of goods, are under increasing pressure to support the diversification of Canada's trade by increasing capacity for both existing and new trade commodities in hopes we can find alternative trading partners and become less reliant on the United States. To add to this pressure, ports have a key role to play in the decarbonization of the shipping industry. The United Nations Trade and Development Organization estimates it will cost between $8 billion and $28 billion annually to decarbonize ships by 2050, and that the cost for infrastructure for completely carbon neutral fuels could cost more than that. As many ports are providers of marine fuels, as well as facilities for goods transfer, investment in green energy and onshore power systems at Canadian ports is a necessary part of developing green shipping corridors to and from Canada. Finally, earlier this month, the International Maritime Organization member states came to an agreement to put a price on carbon emissions from ships, up to 380 per ton of CO2. The cost of carbon will be part of the global trade starting in 2028, and innovation to generate more efficient options is now a business imperative. The financial penalties paid by shippers that exceed these escalating emissions thresholds will generate a pool of climate finance called the Net Zero Fund. This fund can then support development of zero emissions vessels, green port infrastructure, and fuels. Canada likewise must invest to further shipping decarbonization and green infrastructure development at its ports and all along the supply chain. So, as we're experiencing, Canada's supply chain network is complex and many-faceted, but there's a growing awareness of the critical role that ports play as the interface between land and sea. Debbie, can you talk more about Canada's port authorities and their mandate to facilitate trade and protect the environment in Canada?
Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Megan. And that's a great introduction. I think you probably touched on a lot of the things that I would probably mention, and actually I will be touching on in terms of your question later on in my presentation. But I mean, at the core, Canada Port Authorities, each of the 17 Canada Port Authorities at their core is a mandate to facilitate trade, yet at the same time protect the environment and ensure safety and security of port lands. They also have a responsibility to the communities that they operate within. In terms of the, I mean, it's a broad mandate, and trade is central to our economy, which is something I'll mention later. And clearly, if we can optimize our ports, if we can ensure that they're efficient and that they are intersecting with global demands, global trade demands, but also being responsive to where the market is going in terms of investments in technology, in terms of fleets and fleet investments, in terms of the energy transition. I think that ports can be very well positioned to enable Canada in terms of being competitive. This is paramount. I mean, the trade facilitation mandate and the protection of the environment, I think they do represent an opportunity to ports, and not just in terms of the domestic context, but in terms of the interface that Canada has with the rest of the world.
Thanks, Debbie. This next question is for Thomas. And as someone with C40 Cities, can you share a bit about how coastal cities and adjacent ports are working together and taking action to address decarbonization, green infrastructure, or climate change resilience?
Absolutely, Megan. And good afternoon, folks. As Megan mentioned, I'm speaking on behalf of C40 Cities, which is a global NGO historically focused on municipal matters, literally in the name. And for the past 3 years, C40 has expanded its work in the maritime space based on the acknowledgement that a lot of cities in our network also happen to be port cities. And while we are very cognizant that from a jurisdictional standpoint, there is a difference, we are also very sensible on the fact that there are opportunities for collaboration between the municipal level of government, aka the city, and the port authority, as in the independent jurisdiction, on decarbonization. C40 Cities, Port and Shipping Program specifically, has been involved in numerous initiatives. I'm going to mention a few of them. I really couldn't do them justice by rushing through a presentation. I don't want to hijack the webinar either, so I do encourage you to reach out after the webinar if you're interested. But C40 Cities is involved in convening and facilitating which is a couple of green corridors, green shipping corridors, LA Shanghai, LA Singapore, for instance. My colleague Juvaria on this webinar is also in charge of the Green Ports Forum, which is a forum in which port cities, port authorities can collaborate, exchange best practices, and we are supporting various project-specific initiatives, either through technical assistance or from a more capacity building standpoint in the topic of port decarbonization. Let me give you a couple of examples of where port and cities can actually collaborate in a value accretive way. And by value accretive, I mean port and city together, unlocking more value than port and city separately. Specifically, we're looking at a lot of projects in the energy and finance space. Energy-wise, you're well aware that port decarbonization requires significant investments in energy. There is an additional capacity, a net new capacity required to electrify ports that is disproportionate compared to the current electrification needs of these ports. Funnily enough, cities are going through the same brain damage. They need electrification to green their operations. And funnily enough, both ports and cities are facing the same bottlenecks, which is that the utilities, the grid manager specifically, cannot possibly, in most circumstances, deliver the amount of capacity required to meet the terms of the plans of the ports and the cities. So what we're doing is we're fostering, and very soon we're going to be funding joint energy master plans between port and cities, focusing on how the port and the city operations can integrate, collaborate, manage demand within the day, and proactively engage with the utilities, with the grid managers to anticipate their electrification needs. That's for the energy side. In the financing side of things, we think there is a significant untapped potential in sustainability-linked financing. And this mostly boils down to the fact that port operations, while theoretically prime target for sustainability-linked financing, sometimes don't have enough ambitious sustainability plans. If you do take a step back, though, include the ecosystem of the port and primarily the city operations, the city sustainability, there is much more of a case, a compelling business case to lower your cost of borrowing through sustainable financing, either directly for the ports that borrow directly or indirectly for the ports whose concessionaire borrows. Again, this is a very short introduction to what C40 does. Please do reach out should you be interested in learning more. Back to you, Megan.
Thank you, Thomas. That's fascinating. And I think the idea of those funds is going to be more relevant as we move forward and as we get into some of the results that we'll be talking about today. Clara, I'd like to ask about trade of certain commodities. We've been seeing some shifts and also a lot of conversation about how further shifts need to happen. Can you comment on some recent changes to the Canadian oil import and export sector?
Yes, definitely. So while pipelines to and from the US still dominate Canada's crude oil trade, we've seen some notable shifts in tanker activity. And a key development has been the growing role of the West Coast due to the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion. Tanker traffic in Vancouver has surged, balancing out what was once Atlantic-dominated movement due to the closure of refineries, all of which have been closed but Irving, St. John. So this marks a significant rebalancing, now nearly equal tanker activity on both coasts compared to 85% on the Atlantic just a few years ago. And additionally, around 50% of the West Coast crude oil exports went to China in 2024, where previously nearly 100% was sent to the US. So these changes highlight how investments in port and marine terminal infrastructure, like at the West Ridge Terminal in Vancouver, are enabling Canada to diversify its trade routes and better access global markets. And if you want to learn more, ClearSea's recently conducted an analysis on updates to crude tanker traffic in Canada, which will be published shortly. So keep an eye out for that.
Debbie, we're seeing all these tariffs happening and a lot of conversation about how Canada needs to diversify our trade patterns and find some non-North American trade partners for Canada for different things. How do you think ports are responding or are going to be responding to this this call for different trade partners? And do you think other commodities could shift their established trade patterns?
Oh, that is a big question, and that is one of the questions, right, that that everybody's thinking about. Do I think yes, there will likely be some sort of shift. But again, that just depends on if the tariffs and in what form are sustained and implemented. I mean, that's one of the challenges that we're facing now is there seems to be a great deal of uncertainty and unpredictability in terms of you know, the level of the tariff and the target. We know that President Trump's primary objective and target is China, although he does clearly have Canada in his sights. But a lot of it does come down to China in terms of dumping, et cetera, of say steel and other products. So, you know, I think there are certain opportunities for us to mitigate some of that. But again, it does remain to be seen, especially post-election. And once the USMCA starts to be renegotiated, you know, hopefully cooler heads to prevail, and we'll see some sort of maybe change in the level of tariffs. But regardless, I think we are seeing and probably can anticipate some changes. I think, and this isn't mentioned here necessarily, but there are some other proposals that President Trump has issued. There's an executive order that was issued on April 9th for maritime dominance that proposes, it really does look to reestablish U.S. shipbuilding capacity. And there was a decision put out by the U.S. Trade Representative last Thursday that we were looking at potentially tariffs on Chinese-built vessels or fleets that had Chinese-built vessels calling on American ports. That has been, there has been a carve-out for the Canadian foreign fleet, foreign vessels coming from a foreign port, so it does apply to Canadian fleets. Lower transit route than 2,000 nautical miles. So there's been some relief there, but we do have some concerns about it capturing some transits from beyond 2,000 nautical miles. So there's that. But then the other great threat is in the executive order, section 6. It relates to a harbor maintenance tax and a CBP fee for any cargo that is offloaded in a Canadian port and then crossing by land, road, and rail into the United States. We are looking at a fee there. And I think that's also a great concern for our ports and for our supply chains. And I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Amazing. I think what we'll do now is we'll switch over to hear more about what the ports are facing from Debbie's presentation and the research that ACPA has completed recently. And then when we get to the end of the presentations, I'll have one more question as our wrap up. But I think it'll be really helpful to hear more details about some of the research that has been undertaken recently.
Right. Do you want me to share my screen and get into it?
Yeah, please do.
All right. Please forgive me, everyone, while I navigate Zoom.
Just while Debbie's getting set up, I'll just note for everybody attending that we encourage questions. Please feel free to put questions in the chat as the presentation proceeds, or if you'd rather save your questions for the end, we'll have time for Q&A at the end of this webinar, and you'll be happy to have people raise their hands and ask their questions directly if they would like to speak their question. So yeah, keep your questions, and we will have time at the end to go through them.
Sorry, Megan, I'm just trying to share the full screen. And I'm getting like a notes view.
Okay, if you go full screen before you click share, then it should bring it up in full screen.
Yeah, there we go. Now I'm gonna find my Zoom.
Yeah, a lot of steps. Oh, thank you, Christiane. You can see in the chat where you can access the full report if you'd like to take a look and download that. And
Oh yeah, I was gonna mention that. Thanks. You should see my full screen. Do you see it?
yes, we do.
Okay,
Screen ready to go.
great, thanks. So what I'm gonna do is take, I've been given 15 minutes, but I don't think it'll take that long. If it does, Megan, just cut me off as moderator. You know, we have other things we want to get to. So I'm Debbie Murray with the Association of Canadian Port Authorities. What I'd like to do is take you through a bit about our association, and then I'm going to talk to you about some research that we undertook last year looking to determine what port infrastructure needs are in Canada. So first, what I'm going to do is tell you a bit about port authorities and our association. So we have 17 Canada Port Authorities. The port authorities are, sorry, I just realized I need to advance my screen. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. So we have 17 Canada Port Authorities, and you'll see here on the screen the distribution of these CPAs, as I'll be referring to them. We have some on the West Coast, Prince Rupert, British Columbia, Nanaimo, Port Alberni, and then over into Thunder Bay, the Great Lakes, Windsor, Hamilton, Oshawa, which actually is a single CPA that operates 2 port authorities, Port of Toronto, and then up the river, St. Lawrence River, we have the Port of Montreal, Port of Trois-Rivières, Quebec, Saguenay, Sept-Îles, and then the Port of Belledune, St. John, New Brunswick, Halifax, and St. John's, rounding out the Atlantic region. So CPAs were created in 1998. They're quasi-federal agencies with a commercial mandate. They operate at arm's length from government, and prior to that, they were more directly operated by our federal government, and this move was intended to make our ports more entrepreneurial and decentralized. Our association, which represents the 17 port authorities, as I mentioned, we were established in 1958. We're based in Ottawa, so we have interface with Transport Canada and other federal departments and agencies, and we interface with them on policy and regulatory matters on behalf of the CPAs. Sorry, why is it not advancing? You can see here some of the cargo, the total cargo of the CPAs. Our most recent data set is for 2021, and in that time period, we had 345 million tons that were transmitted. Our ports are both coastal and inland ports, saltwater as well as freshwater. Most of the port authorities handle a variety of commodities, liquid and dry bulk, containers and break bulk. I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but I just wanted to provide this overview. And in terms of volume, CPAs jointly handle over 70% of Canada's waterborne cargo. And most recently, of course, CPAs have become also very involved in cruise tourism, which had been growing previous to COVID and has really bounced back since 2022. And this has been a very fast-growing sector for several of our members. CPAs have a single shareholder. Sorry, I don't know why it's not moving. There we go. They have a single shareholder, which is the shareholder, which is the federal government, and they are governed by the Canada Marine Act of 1998. They each have their own boards of directors, with a majority of the directors appointed by the federal government and additional directors appointed by municipal and federal levels of government. Nominating committees made up of port users, evaluate and recommend candidates for most of the federally appointed directors, although these recommendations are not always followed. And through their governance, CPAs are meant to be locally responsive. Under the Canada Marine Act, this is a really critical point, especially in light of what I'm going to be talking about. Ports are expected to be financially self-sufficient through their own revenues. They do not receive public appropriations and funds through the federal budget on a regular basis. They don't receive, as I mentioned, operating funds, but we will see, as we will see, their financial capacity is limited in ways that have made them more reliant than they might have otherwise been on federal funding for infrastructure. I will note that the NTCF, National Trade Corridor Fund, has been very generous to ports, over $1 billion in port project funding, but this is not a dedicated fund for ports, nor is it permanent. So I've told you a bit about CPAs, I've told you a bit about ACPA. So what I'd like to do is talk to you now about the study. So we know that 2/3 of Canada's GDP is based on trade. And of that waterborne trade that I mentioned earlier, it consists of exports of, sorry, got two screens going here. 2/3. So waterborne trade, that's exports of commodities, grain, seafood, minerals, etc. The imports are consumer durables, cars, electronics, food, and pharmaceuticals. So that's sort of what goes in and goes out. Ports are also key to the Canadian economy. As we well know, I mean, they connect Canada's trade and its economy. So now, in terms of quality of life, global linkages, it is, and trade diversification, we know that ports are, especially with the commentary we had at the beginning of this webinar, it's more than important than it. So given this context, what are port infrastructure needs and what's the status of funding and financing? So what we did was we decided to undertake a research project into this. We contracted CPCS to conduct the study, and they started it in January 2024. The objective for this was to provide ACPA and interested stakeholders with data-driven insights. We wanted to support our efforts in communication advocacy for the importance of investing in port infrastructure. And, you know, a key part of that was being able to, with a number, say what these needs are. So the key question was, what are the infrastructure needs of CBAs over the next 15 years until 2040 and beyond? What's the type of infrastructure needed? And what's the type of investment? So we looked at 2 time periods up to from 24 to 28, and then 28 up to 2040. A bit about the methodology. So for the first 6 months, January to June, we administered a survey to the 17 CPAs, and we also conducted one-on-one interviews to kind of dig deeper into the data and fill in any missing data. We also conducted interviews with stakeholders from industry just to get some validation and some external input to the analysis. We also conducted a jurisdictional review of United States, Netherlands, and Australia ports. We've, looking at if we had a number around the infrastructure needs, we also wanted to know what others were doing, what other jurisdictions were doing. So that would help us in terms of our analysis of our numbers, in terms of the number and the financing and funding. From June until October, CPCS analyzed the data that they had collected, resulting in a final report that was presented to ACPA and its board in December of 2024. We then formally launched the report in, I believe it was early February, and it is now available on our website. Christiane, our Director of Communications, I believe she put it in the chat. So if you want to read it, which I would encourage you to do, and of course, we're also available to answer any questions on this, just please go to the chat, download a copy, and take a look at the report. So that was the methodology. That was the research question. So now what are the results? So I'll start from the high and then get into some of the specific dimensions. We looked at, as I mentioned, 2 time periods, as this graphic shows, 2024 to 28 and 2029 to 2040, with a view to determining short-term and longer-term port infrastructure needs. So in the short term, we collected data that resulted in a 10,000 $21.5 billion need by 2028. Which does see a split of $4 billion to existing infrastructure and $6 billion to new infrastructure. But collecting data to 2040 can be understandably more difficult. We don't always know what projects are, but we have a sense of what the trends are. The CPAs, they do have some long-term plans. So then what we did was we modeled out scenarios for 2040 based on the 10 million that gave as of 2028. This gave us a high range of 21.5 billion to 5 billion at the low end. So you can see that there's cumulatively a growth up to 2040. So 10 billion, 10.5 billion by 2028, and then another 21.5 billion by up until 2040. So where is this money going? What's driving it? Where is it being directed? So there's the top three areas is operational efficiency. That was the top priority of CapEx at 82%, followed closely by expansion and growth. And aging infrastructure was third at 48%. This is not surprising. Operational efficiencies and expansion are the two main factors for capital investment and support increased revenue generation and cash, which ports need for maintenance of existing infrastructure. Specific ports can include, some of the specific projects in that category can include dry ports and intermodal facilities to reduce dwell time and expedite cargo clearance. Climate adaptation needs were also identified for all ports, and for smaller and mid-sized ports seeing significant rehabilitation bills resulting in less focus on expansionary investments. This was also a key need that was identified. The challenge for CPAs is to invest in a way, be it in existing or new infrastructure in response to key drivers, to generate revenues that ports need for operational and financial sustainability. So first slide talked about what the gap is. This slide talks about what the plans are in terms of where this would be spent. So operational efficiency, expansion and growth, and aging infrastructure are the top three. So what we see coming out of our research was significant funding gaps. So which you can see in terms of the funding allocation for identified projects over the life of a project. 61% of funding for identified projects is not secured, which can jeopardize the completion of the projects for efficiency, expansion, and growth, which I just touched on. You can see by the graph on the left here that the unsecured funding challenge persists right into construction, with funding still partially unsecured, which can then still add uncertainty into planning and overall port capacity. Given the size of the funding needs, the applications I mentioned, and the challenges with securing funding right into construction, there's also the question of urgency. We found that over 2/3 of projects had high or moderate levels of urgency, which was defined by the risk of critical failure. For member respondents, failure was seen in aging infrastructure, climate change, deferred rehabilitation, and the risk of operational disruption. So again, those are all the things that define the risk and drive the urgency. CPAs, again, as I mentioned, must balance limited capital funds they generate through revenues with the need to invest in new infrastructure and address the urgency of these projects. So here's some of the key takeaways we have from our research, some of them that I mentioned, but they're summed up very nicely in this table. As I mentioned, 10.5 billion is needed by 2040, 5 billion by 2028 with a funding gap of 1.24 billion. 61% of the funding is not secured, but many projects to 2040 are still, as I mentioned, very early stage. 66% of capital is high and medium urgency driven by risk of critical failure, which I just mentioned. And 3/4 of near-term investment is for new projects and 1/4 is for rehabilitation. Most investment is geared towards efficiency and growth. We also, as I mentioned, did jurisdictional review, and I'll just touch on those very quickly and wrap it up. We looked at Australia, Netherlands, the United States, so a few specific ports within those jurisdictions to get a sense of what the funding and operational governance models were. And really netting out of that is that CPAs are more limited in terms of their activities and their financing options with, of course, different governance. When we looked at, the funding, sort of who pays, taxpayer versus private, versus the financing, which, the specific mechanisms that are used to actually fund. The CPAs, again, are also limited for both jurisdictions. So, given this context in Canada, when we looked at these three comparator jurisdictions, we could see that Canadian port authorities, they're limited in terms of the flexibility that they have to access the funds. And as I mentioned, they're also challenged in terms of what their actual funding needs are. So what are our key takeaways from this? Well, now we know even more than ever that CPAs face a pressure to build the port infrastructure that Canada needs to compete and for its trade to diversify. We're looking at 10 billion by 2028 and up to 21.5 by 2040. We have the challenge of balancing and securing funding for optimization, growth, and maintenance. The funding and financing needs are growing more urgent given the short-term and long-term needs, the project timelines, and the challenges of just securing the finance along the timeline of a project. We don't believe that public funding will not fill the gap. And as a result, we think financial flexibility should be considered. Some of those financing mechanisms that I mentioned earlier, and globally looking at some of these models in other jurisdictions, there's opportunities for these models and practices to be replicated here. So that's it. I'll wrap it up. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Debbie. That's a really great overview, and we do have a couple of questions popping up. But I think what we're going to do is we'll go through the next presentation, and then we'll get to questions at the end. So please keep the questions coming, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. But I'm going to hand it over to Clara and Thomas now to share some of the research that ClearSeas and C40 Cities undertook on a very similar vein, but this was more of a global scan to look at how funding is acquired and applied in different jurisdictions. And I think we're going to see a lot of similar themes. So Clara, over to you.
Great, thanks, Megan. Just a second, are you seeing the presentation?
Yes, we can see the presentation. Good to
Great,
go.
thank you. Well, thank you, Debbie. That was a really interesting overview of the infrastructure needs of Canadian ports and also the unique financing challenges that CPAs face. So we're going to continue where you left off a bit with some more of an international scope and looking at different examples from around the world of port investment infrastructures and best practices derived from that. So today we're going to walk through the Port Investment Toolkit, which is a practical framework developed by MTBS, Marine and Transport Business Solutions, for C40 Cities and ClearSeas. And the purpose of this was to help ports plan and prioritize strategic infrastructure investments that support resilient, efficient, and future-ready marine operations. MTBS produced this report, and it's based on, it shows port infrastructure investment structures from around the world, and it uses these 20 real-life case studies to create a toolkit with best practices for how to make such investments. And you'll be able to see various different financing structures from around the world, some of which could be useful for Canada and some of which might be more difficult to apply. So here is a map of all of the case studies. So as you can see, they were very diverse from, I think, every continent. And also different types of projects. Some are more expansion projects, and then others are climate adaptation or decarbonization or that kind of thing. So the toolkit starts with understanding who invests. So this is the port typology of port managing bodies from the report. So we classify them by governance type or model. So for that, there's public authority, corporatized, state-owned, or private, and then by business model. So that's landlord or integrator. And this matters because each model shapes investment roles, autonomy, and revenue models. So just for instance, integrator ports are often more directly involved in terminal operations, while landlord ports lease assets to third parties. The toolkit categorizes investments into two domains. The first is transport nodes, so such as terminals, equipment, and infrastructure. And then the second is investment for energy hubs, so that's clean fuel production, energy pipelines, and energy storage. And each presents different financing challenges and value propositions. Ports use various organizational models from different direct investment to joint ventures or subsidiaries. The model used depends on the type of port and investment. For instance, onshore power supply, which allows vessels to plug into onshore electricity, and also CO2 pipelines often use joint venture models that combine port authorities with utilities or private users. An example of that is the Porthos CO2 pipeline project in Rotterdam, which will provide an underground CO2 storage facility in the North Sea for CO2 from industry in the port of Rotterdam. But as you can see, there are a variety of different approaches. And I invite you to look at the report if you are interested in seeing it in more detail. And then projects can fall into four types based on commercial and societal value. So projects with both commercial and society value are easier to fund. But then there are many types of investments that fall into type 2. So those often include green investments like onshore power. And these are socially beneficial, but commercially not viable. And then these often need public funding to bridge the funding gap, which is something Debbie talked about being a key concern as well. So each investment type creates both commercial and societal value, but carries unique risks. So these are just some examples that were included in the case studies that we looked at of different investment types. And just for example, to continue with onshore power supply, that brings strong environmental benefits, but it often lacks user demand without regulation. So that can lead to underutilization. Meanwhile, new terminals are commercially viable, but require upfront tenant commitment in many cases to reduce the risk with such a large capital investment. And then another example, pipelines may offer strong environmental value, but they also carry high utilization risk. So for each of these, they're both values and risks that have to be managed for investment. And there are many factors that can contribute to a funding gap. Debbie talked about some of these as well in her presentation. So these include those examples I mentioned where there's a high societal value but low commercial return. There are also issues when it's early stage technologies with uncertain uptake. And then if there's a lack of regulatory support without mandates, then users may not adopt. And then also market fragmentation or weak user commitment. And understanding these drivers can help design effective public funding tools like grants, contracts for difference, which guarantee a fixed price per unit for energy, or guaranteed offtake agreements to close the gap and unlock investment. The toolkit also quantifies typical funding gaps based on different investment types. So knowing where gaps exist can help design better funding instruments. So by investment types, often the largest funding gaps are for landside port infrastructure and also onshore power supply. And these across the studies were generally 50% gap or more. And then some others vary greatly, like pipelines and green fuel production. They varied from around 0 to 50% based on user commitments and volumes. And then terminal equipment usually has a minimal gap unless greening existing assets. So how do you pay for all this? The toolkit outlines several common sources. So publicly, there's local and national grants, which are often used for rail access and onshore power supply projects. Then there are international grants. An example from the report is Europe's Connecting Europe Facility CEF program, which supports energy infrastructure investments across Europe. There are also IFI loans, which provide lower interest rates and longer terms, like an example from the World Bank. And then on the commercial side, commercial bank loans and internal funds, and these are often used for projects with strong cash flows. And successful projects often blend multiple sources. For example, the Porthos project I mentioned in Rotterdam used EU grants and state-backed equity to complete its funding. So when planning investments, policy can play a supporting role or act as a barrier. So a takeaway from this report was just the importance of policy frameworks and how they must be multi-layered, international, national, and local, and public funding, regulation, and spatial planning must align in order to reduce investor uncertainty and unlock capital. And if you don't have that, then it can be much more challenging. From the 20 international case studies included, 13 good practices emerged across 4 areas. And those were policy objectives, regulation, funding instruments, and governance. These include some of the good practices include set long-term measurable goals, harmonize regulation across levels, combine funding with enforceable mandates, and use open competitive grant processes that enable a stable investment climate and align public spending with societal values. And we're going to take a closer look at good practice 12, which was derived from one of the Canadian case studies. So giving port managing bodies agency over financial management. So this came from the case study on borrowing limits of the Canadian port managing bodies, or the CPAs. So in Canada, port authorities have capped borrowing limits, and that creates a barrier to large scale investment. So allowing port managing bodies to manage reserves and borrow more flexibly, like in other case study examples like Barcelona and Amsterdam, boosts responsiveness and investment capacity. Beyond funding, ports need strong investment capacity, and so 6 additional practices include partnering with capable third parties, phase project design, early planning due to long approvals, increasing lease income for stable class and cash flows. And the goal with all of these is to make ports more investable over time. This chart is designed to help ports determine the best context-specific organizational model to use based on who benefits from the investment. Is it just the port authority or third-party users? Who has capabilities and interests and ownership? Can partners de-risk or add expertise? And then through this, it's supposed to help you get some idea of what might be the best model to go after. So for instance, if benefits are shared and technical know-how is needed, then a joint venture might be ideal if it's possible. And then this diagram summarizes the final step-by-step approach recommended in the toolkit to help both policymakers and port managing bodies through investment planning and execution. So these steps include, for all the stakeholders and notably government, part of the design of this policy framework, so setting goals defining the strategic objectives for port development. So that could be trade, climate, and industrial development. Understanding the typology, so identifying what kind of port you're working with and what investment type you're pursuing. Then selecting the right model, so match investment needs with organization and funding models. Assessing the funding gap and aligning regulations and financial tools to develop an appropriate policy framework. And then once that's done, the port managing body must then secure the financing and plan delivery, and also monitor the outcome and adapt. It's important to note that it's shown as a stepwise process, but port development is dynamic, and the cycle has to be iterative for it to really work. So in summary, some of the key insights from this project include the changing expectations. So just around sort of what we've talked about in this webinar so far. Canadian ports are expected to play an increased role in trade diversification. So it's important. These infrastructure investments are, key to that, and also to supporting the global energy transition. And then there are these critical funding gaps, as Debbie also mentioned, due in part to high upfront costs, uncertain returns, and restrictive regulatory systems. So some of the actionable strategies from the report, incorporating both private and public funding mechanisms, such as grants and concessional loans, along with innovative tools like contracts for difference, to unlock investments that are not commercially viable on their own, but might offer strong environmental and or economic benefits. And then creating governance models that help enable ports to better leverage private capital and international expertise. And then, as I showed you, this step-by-step guide, which hopefully is helpful in increasing, or at least giving a starting point to increasing port investments in relevant, resilient, and sustainable infrastructure. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara. That was a really great overview and well in time as well. So we do have a few questions in the chat, I think mostly following Debbie's presentation. But before we get to those, I just want to ask, in Canada, we're in the lead up to the final decision on our federal election. Various candidates have committed to future investments for trade diversification. The Liberal Party is committed to a trade diversification corridor fund. Conservatives want to pre-approve a national energy corridor to speed up infrastructure projects. NDP is going to invest in infrastructure, and the Green Party wants to invest in clean power projects. So thinking about the research that each of these two different research projects, what do you think your research can offer policy strategists within government, and what do you think they can take away from this as we think about our next steps as a country? Who wants to go first? I'll let you choose.
I'll go first.
Thanks, Debbie.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you'd like to know that the research that you're doing or undertaking is going to be applied and used. And if there's any time for it to be used, given what we talked about at the beginning around the challenges around tariffs and trade, and now with the upcoming election, we hope, and we have presented our results to the government pre-election. We are hoping that, the numbers that we've come up with in terms of long-term, short-term needs, the urgency, as I mentioned, and the funding gap itself, especially along the project timeline, we do hope that there's some uptake. We know that both parties, the Conservatives and the Liberals, have definitely indicated a strong recognition and support for ports, the role that they play in trade, and have signaled not just financial support, but the regulatory one window solution is also a critical thing in terms of getting projects built. So we think there's quite a bit of use in our research, and I think there's probably definitely some research in the research that C40 Cities has undertaken also.
Thomas, anything you'd like to add?
Thanks, Megan. And look, I couldn't agree more with what Debbie just said. I think folks, if you're attending this webinar, nothing in these reports should come across as earth-shattering or even remotely controversial. I think it's fairly well acknowledged that there is a need for more funding. On the back of the positive externalities, there is a need for financial structuring creativity based on concessional financing mostly, and there is a need for more agency of ports over their financial frameworks, giving them the ability, the power to enter into creative commercial agreements with the private sector, let it be JVs, public-private partnerships, you name it. I think these reports are very important in contributing to an, I would say, evidence-based, rooted in international best practices advocacy. If you want to convince public decision makers, especially at the federal level in Canada, I think these are very interesting discussion openers, or at the very least discussion contributors. And that's the value that I see in this research.
Yeah, just to elaborate on that, it's a systematic approach. Ideally, we want to see systematic evidence-based frameworks developed and applied.
Absolutely.
Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Debbie and Thomas have said to this point. And yeah, I hope that both reports can find their way onto the desk of someone in government who has a role in shaping policy in this area, no matter who is in power. Because yeah, I agree, having these strong evidence-based studies like this available, you hope that someone will use them to actually put something into practice. And then I also hope that this report reaches international audience, because I think it provides useful information for many countries, port infrastructure investments beyond just Canada.
Hope so too. So we have a couple of minutes left. We'll try to get to some of the questions in the chat. So first, Debbie Javaria Veldkamp with C40 Cities asks, how does energy transition show up in the numbers of your report? What portion of that need is for transition to clean energy infrastructure, and what assumptions were made about the speed and scale of the transition?
That's great question. So how does it show up in the numbers? I'd say we do have decarbonization identified as in terms of 40% of the projects. I'm sure there's probably some overlap between operational efficiency and decarbonization in terms of where capital's being allocated. I'd have to go through a bit more and probably get back to her on some of the specifics, but I'd say off the top of my head, 40%. And the portion of that needed for transition, I mean, that's why we were looking at to 2040, right? Like, that's a big reason why we picked that timeline, because we know that there's an energy transition. Ports are going to be key, not just in terms of the bunkering of the fuel, but vessels are going to need this for propulsion. Like, it's going to be a big part. So it's embedded within the report, and it's a key assumption to the report. And in terms of assumptions, like I said, at speed and scale, we're looking at, globally 2040 in terms of 2040 here is our second time frame in the research, but it's going to take some time. But there are some steps that are happening right now in terms of that transition. So I can get back to her on that, though.
Yeah, and I encourage
Any
anybody who's got questions that we won't get to today to reach out to Debbie, Thomas, or Clara to seek more information. We all encourage discussion around these findings, and hope that we can share them widely, as there's lots of relevance for across the country and beyond. I think we probably don't have time for any more questions. Unfortunately, we had a lot to talk about today, but as I said, please do reach out to the speakers directly to ask your questions. Lots of really good questions in the chat, and I will send these. I'll save the questions and send them to the speakers afterwards, so that they can respond directly if they'd like. So thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate the time from our speakers, Debbie, Thomas, and Clara, and the respective organizations in committing to furthering this really interesting work and contributing to a safer and more sustainable supply chain for Canada. I think we'll wrap it up there unless anybody has any closing closing remarks.